our Outstanding Guest Speaker Series, the TMCC Library is proud to present Lieutenant Colonel Allen Satterlee. He was born in Tampa, Florida, and graduated from Lakeland Senior High School in 1971. He then went on to graduate from the Salvation Army School for Officers Training in Atlanta in 1965. Later, he received his BS degree from Liberty University, subsequently receiving his MA degree from Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary. In 1975, he became a Salvation Army officer and has served across the South, as well as in Singapore, Papua New Guinea, and Jamaica. He is the author of 11 books, mostly about the history of the Salvation Army, and he currently serves as Editor-in-Chief and National Secretary at the Salvation Army National Headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia. We put all our hands together and welcome Lieutenant Allen.
Thank you. Okay, so I go ahead and get started, I guess.
Yes, I'm going to turn down the lights a little bit to make it easier for them to see the slides.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for letting me come and be with you in this way. I'm going to give you just the sketchiest of histories of the Salvation Army, and a little explanation of who we are, and then a little bit about how you can do research for, genealogical purposes and so on. So here we go, a short primer on the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army, this is our mission statement. The Salvation Army, an international movement, is an evangelical part of the Universal Christian Church. Its message is based on the Bible. Its ministry is motivated by the love of God. Its mission is to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ and to meet human needs in His name without discrimination. So the Salvation Army is a unique organization in the sense that it's fully a Christian denomination, but it's also fully a social service agency. So there's not like part of it is not the church and part of it is not the social service agency. It's all one integrated body. And that's different. A lot of churches have social service outreach, but it's sort of a sub-part of who they are. But for us, it's fully integrated. So anyway, our Christian stance is what makes us feel that we must be involved in the what we can to alleviate suffering. So that's what we are, and if you don't understand that, well, join the rest of the world. There's other folks get confused about that as well. All right, let me go on. The Salvation Army was started by William and Catherine Booth. They were originally Methodist ministers, this is in England. Catherine began to preach at a time when women preachers were unheard of. She was a real trailblazer in that way. And in fact, because of her participation in the Salvation Army, men and women have always been equals in the Salvation Army, so that any position a man can hold, a woman can hold, and they have. And so we've always recognized women. And this was in the mid-19th century, so it was way in advance of anybody else. We were the first really to ordain women as ministers. The Booths resigned from the Methodist Church to begin an itinerant ministry. Again, this is in England, and they were drawn to the poor, especially in the East End of London. So it says in 1865, they joined volunteers ministering in East London. There was a small group of people who were doing street evangelism. William Booth was attracted to them, came back and told his wife, "I found my destiny," and she joined him, and the rest for us is history. They formed what was called the Christian Mission. That was the original name of our organization, but the name was changed to the Salvation Army in 1878. Now, I'm not sure if I say this in the next slide, but when that name change happened, it also signified a change in our government and how we operated. So here we go. I'm going to hit on some of these. The change of name signifies a change in the organization. We became organized on a quasi-military type of structure, so that those who are ordained ministers in the Salvation Army hold various ranks, such as lieutenant, captain, major, lieutenant colonel, like I am, colonel, and then we have a rank called commissioner. And then we have one general who's in charge of all the Salvation Army in the world. When we started, we suffered a lot of persecution in most countries, including the United States. In fact, quite a bit of severe persecution here. one thing was, of course, there weren't too many people running around in military uniforms saying they were church, and so that attracted attention. And the late 19th century was not a very tolerant time of in our history as a country, and so there was a great deal of persecution. By that we mean we did street meetings, and they were often attacked. Even when we were inside our buildings, people would come in and often destroy all the furnishings and so on and so forth. So what it did is it galvanized our folks rather than scaring them away. It became international when it invaded the United States officially in 1880. We're now in 131 countries and colonies around the world. We're still growing, actually. We keep adding new countries and colonies. There are a few colonies left, like French Guiana, for example. We're there, and that's a colony of France. Social work was integrated into our structure with the launch of the Darkest England scheme. What that was is in late 1880s, Dr. Stanley went to Africa looking for Dr. Livingstone, the missionary, and he wrote a book about his exploits called In Darkest Africa and the Way Out. And that talked about all the strange sights he saw in Africa and so on, and the animals and the different tribes, etc. And of course, a lot of people in England were captivated by this. And William Booth contended that England, which then proclaimed itself to be the most civilized place in the world, he said there's a underbelly here in England that is just as dark as any of the jungles of Africa. And it's, of course, made up of the poor and those who are in desperate circumstances. Of course, this is toward the end of the Industrial Revolution. Their labor unions had not yet brought equality in the workplace. And so he was saying essentially that 10% of the people in England at that time were in such a precarious financial situation that at any time they could actually die. In fact, at this point in time in the streets of London, this is around, again, 1890, 400 people a year were dying of starvation on the streets of London. So it was not a far-fetched thing at all, no exaggeration. You had people staying in boarding houses that literally 3 people slept in the same bed in shifts, so that when 2 people were out, another person slept in the bed, then they got up, and of course you can imagine how unsanitary that was. And it was really a very, very desperate thing. And so he came up with this Darkest England scheme, which pretty much said this is a roadmap for how we can help the poorest of the poor. And that became fully integrated into the Salvation Army. Before this, the Salvation Army was purely an evangelical organization, but at that point, the social work became part of our fabric. Finally, the Salvation Army had widespread acceptance following its service during World War I. You see the picture behind these words and so on, and that's actually a picture of some of our what we call donut girls, who really became quite endeared to the soldiers because they went right to the front lines and they served donuts. Actually, donuts were kind of an accident. We really originally started serving pies, but donuts were easier to make. And there it is. And it was a taste of home, and the soldiers really liked it. And up until this time, the Salvation Army had been kind of a joke to the people, the American public. Some people liked us, but kind of a joke. But when that happened during the First World War, all the soldiers wrote back home, and when they came back home, said, you got to help the Salvation Army. They were the ones who were right there with us. And so I don't know if any of you have heard of National Donut Day, but that's actually commemorates the Salvation Army serving donuts in the First World War. So if you read up on it, you'll find that that's the origin of that. Let me move on. So let's talk about resources available for your research. And this is a vintage picture, obviously from Brainerd, Minnesota. There are career sheets of those who have served as Salvation Army officers going back to the 19th century. So again, we have 2 basic levels of membership in the Salvation Army. One is the officer, which again is the ordained clergy, and then we have what we call soldiers, and those are the people who have made the Salvation Army their church. So rather than calling them members, we call them soldiers. So we don't have them on the soldiers because there's frankly too many of them, and it would have been impossible to keep up with it. But the officers is a relatively small number. Like in the United States today, there are only about 3,500 active officers. So it's not a huge number, and it's easy to keep up with. And there really never has been much more than that 3,500 number at any one point in our history. There's something called the disposition of forces, and that's a directory of Salvation Army locations and what officers were serving there at the time. So I'll explain a little bit more of our structure in a moment. But that disposition of forces is it was really the way we could keep track of who was where. In the early days, it was published every month, but then it got to be published like once a year. And now it's online, so we don't even have paper copies anymore. But the disposition of forces is helpful. If you knew that your great Aunt Nellie was serving in Chicago in 1921, you could go to the listings for Chicago and find out where exactly she was and get an idea of what she was doing at that time. And then you could cross-reference that with other things to help you, find more information. There are microfilm copies of the War Cry, our official magazine, going back to 1881. Unfortunately, these are not digitized. These are only on microfilm. So, and they're not available through interlibrary loan, and that's another shortcoming of them. But they are on microfilm, and again, I'll explain where you can access those should you be interested. So the War Cry, especially again in the earlier days, they would have reports from different places where the Salvation Army was serving. And those would tell, again, people would send them in, and you would have an idea of what's going on, but you'd also have the names of people listed in those reports. And so that, again, is a good reference. Many diaries, photographs, etc., spanning the entire history of the Salvation Army in the USA are available in our various collections. So back in the course of the old days, people really kept a lot of diaries. And the diaries, a lot of times, are fascinating because they've not been censored or anything. They're people's honest opinions. Now, you get a lot of really boring stuff, like I had to do the laundry today and that kind of stuff. But you get occasionally some real insights on in the way people lived. And also, if it happens to be on one of your relatives, you can find out their own thoughts about what was going on in that point in their lives. If you're interested in any of this, you can contact Susan Mitchum at this address, and you'll see that. Listen, I've sent over my PowerPoint, so you all have a copy of this so you can get these addresses later. This next one is a terrible address. It goes on and on and on. So that is actually a portal to search our database here at National Headquarters. This is the most comprehensive of the Salvation Army historical sites or historical collections. So you can, say, put in the name of Robert Cooper. And if there's a Robert Cooper for whom we have information, it'll come up on that database. So again, I've sent this copy of the PowerPoint, and somehow you can get it from this. I try to see if there's a shorter version of this thing, because this is just gosh awful. But there isn't. This is it. Okay, let me move on. Let me give you an example here, and this is courtesy of your instructor. This is her grandmother from, I think, in the 1920s, or late 20s and early 30s. And you see, her name is Captain Bartlett. Now, if you look at this picture, there's some things that it can tell you, and I'll come back to that in just a moment, what we can learn just by looking at the picture. Now, the other thing is we have this newspaper clipping, which is very helpful, and you'll see it just tells a little bit about Captain Bartlett. It tells us she is farewelling. We use the term farewelling when an officer is moved from one place to another place. And so the farewell service is just saying goodbye to them, and then they move on to the next place. All right. Anyway, so we have this, and so we have that little snapshot of her. So with that, let me tell you, here's the career sheet, and this helps as well. So I was able to look this up, and here's what we have on Edith May Bartlett, born December 1st, 1908. She resigned to get married in 1932, or your teacher wouldn't be there with you today. And it tells us that she started out in 1927 in Mandan, North Dakota, She was the rank she had first was probationary lieutenant. Then she was moved. You'll see how often these people moved in the old days. December 1st, 1927, she was moved to Valley City, North Dakota. Then she moved to International Falls, Minnesota. You see this every 6 months almost, kind of thing. And then in June 28th, 1928, just the day before she went to International Falls, she was made a full lieutenant. And then she went to Bemidji, Minnesota, hot spot, in July, so on and so forth. So you just see reading through, and it follows it right through. These are all the places where she served. You see March 14th, 1929, she was promoted to captain, and then she resigned September 23rd, 1932. So what you have here is a pretty clear picture of someone who had a relatively short career as a Salvation Army officer, but you can imagine someone who serves it lifelong, like I've been doing this since I was 22. So mine, but we didn't. Fortunately, now we don't move every 6 months. That's a really good development over the years. But it still would have all this information that I've served, went to this place at this time, then it went to the next place at this time, and so on and so forth. So sometimes there's confidential information on these career sheets. So what happens is when you ask for one of these, the archivist here will transcribe the information, but will not give you a PDF or a photocopy of the career sheet because it is confidential. And again, sometimes this, fortunately, good old Captain Bartlett was a wonderful person, but some people made mistakes along the way, and you know, that's all I'll say about that. So here we go. All right, so that's what you can learn from the career sheet. All right, what can be gleaned from the officer? Well, we know this. She was an officer. And if you look at the epaulets, they signify the rank. I don't know if you can see my uniform I have now, but you may be able to see I have a red epaulet, and that says that I'm an officer. And then by looking at the way my epaulet is trimmed, it tells what rank I am. So the silver piping says that, and the crest here, what we call the crest, says I'm a lieutenant colonel. Anybody in the Salvation Army is familiar with this would be able to tell that by just looking at my shoulder. Of course, most people don't know that. So what I can tell by looking at pictures of Salvationists, I can usually tell if their epaulet is clear, whether they are a soldier or an officer. So that's helpful. Also, she's wearing a pin, and that pin tells us she's serving in the USA. As I said, the Salvation Army is international, and the only country that used an eagle on top of what we call the crest, and we don't do that anymore, but back in this period of time was the United States. It has to do with some sort of incident that happened in our history here. Now everybody uses a crown that's on top, and if you look up Salvation Army crest, you'll see it has a crown on top. But the eagle tells us she served at a time prior to 1980 and was in the USA. The style of uniform indicates it was the early part of the 20th century. The style of the photo also is an indication. If you know anything about photography and history, you'll know that there are different styles of portrait photography. And of course, we can see that particular style being used when this picture was taken of her, again, the late 1920s. But also the style of uniform, that dress uniform she was wearing is a more informal uniform that we used, and again, was only used for a certain period of time. So we had no other information. By looking at her uniform, we could tell these things. The newspaper article tells us she served in the USA Central Territory because, again, the Salvation Army is divided into 4 territories. It hasn't always been that way, but we know from this one that she served in the USA Central Territory because the Central Territory was existing at that time. Also, the career sheet gives the dates of service. If this career sheet is not available, a review of the disposition of forces for the Central Territory will also give dates and addresses of her service. And in fact, a lot of these will tell where the home address was. Part of what's always been a part of the Salvation Army is they don't pay us much at all, even today. So what they do is they give us a home, and we move from place to place. There's already a home waiting for us. It's all furnished and all that. We just move right in. So with the disposition of forces, it will tell the address of the Salvation Army. It will tell also if there's a separate home. Back in this day, a lot of the people lived in apartments above the building. They were downtown buildings, and you had the bottom floor, which is where the people had their meetings and so on, and also did their social services. But then you had another floor probably had offices and so on, and another meeting hall for young people. And then the third floor, which is pretty typical arrangement, would have had the apartment where the officer lived. Okay, cross-referencing the dates of service and location can be supplemented with searches in local newspapers and/or city directory. So when I've done researches, I have when I knew certain things were happening, somebody was in a city for a special event or whatever, and I knew those dates, relative dates, I could go and look for local corroborating information. The thing you have to remember, though, is anything that appears in a publication is always going to be behind by, depending on, again, the frequency of the publication, it's going to be behind by a minimum of 6 weeks, but sometimes as much as several months. So if we knew that Captain Bartlett was doing meetings, say in St. Paul, Minnesota, in 1928, that would be helpful if we went to the war cry and found that. But what we'd have to realize, if the war cry had a date on it of August 1928, we really needed to begin our research to see if there's anything in the newspaper, probably in April or May. And again, because of the time lag. All right. Also, this is just kind of general information. For more information, the Salvation Army's national website is salvationarmyusa.org. If you're interested in books about the Salvation Army, crestbooks.com is the place to get them. You can check with your local Salvation Army. Depending on where you are, the Salvation Army is like anything else. We have some places that are super efficient and some places that are less so. And so, and some are very aware of their history, some are less so. So depending, you can check with your local Salvation Army. Now, these are the 4 territorial centers. The Central USA essentially covers, it goes as far west as Nebraska, and I guess, forgive me for my ignorance of geography there, North and South Dakota and so on. And then it would go as far east as Indiana. It would go down as far south. Indiana would kind of be the border, and Kansas kind of across there. Colorado would be in what we call the Western Territory, so it doesn't go down that far. The Eastern Territory is just like it sounds. It's on the upper northeast of the United States. It goes from Maine down to Delaware, and as far west as Ohio. And then cuts across there. Kentucky's in the Southern Territory. South is, again, as I just indicated, Maryland, all the way down the eastern seaboard, and then as far west as Texas, Oklahoma, and then back up to Kentucky and Tennessee. If you look these places up, they'll show you their map. And the Western USA is everything west of all those places, and includes Alaska and Hawaii. So that's all I have on the presentation, and I wanted to leave time for questions. Fortunately, I've done a bit of research, so I have had a lot of experience diving into these records. So maybe I have something that can help you.
Did anyone send a chat message? No? Okay. Well,
let me look. I've got to. I guess I get off this sharing thing real quick.
Okay.
Which I can't remember how to do. Stop sharing. Okay, I found it. All right, chat message. No, it doesn't look like it.
Okay. Well, does anyone have any questions?
One question, when she retired to get married, was that a voluntary or an involuntary separation?
Yeah, we who are Salvation Army officers are given a mandatory retirement date. Mine's in about 5 weeks, so I'm happy.
No, I'm talking about when she got married.
Yeah, in other words, I think the question was, could she have stayed married and be a Salvation Army?
Oh, that is a good question. Okay. Yeah, the Salvation Army, because men and women are equals, it requires that both are officers. So if a woman, well, in this case, Captain Bartlett, fell in love with somebody, which apparently she did, unless he was a Salvation Army officer, she would have to resign and stop being a Salvation Army officer. Now, she could be a soldier of the Salvation Army, a member of the Salvation Army. That would be fine. But she could no longer maintain her officership. So that means that those of us who are officers only marry other officers. We believe the Lord guides us to the right person. I've done well, so I have no complaints.
Any other questions? I got a few. Let's see here. You talked about the epaulets, the uniform, and by the way, I found it fascinating that you were doing forensic photography on my grandma's photo, because we've actually had many speakers in my class talking about forensic photography. So you actually made some really great points that I hope will reinforce what the attendees here in my lab have already learned about those clues in those old photographs. I just really thought it was wonderful what you did with, pulling out the clues from, the style of photography, the button that she was wearing around her neck, so on and so on. So, kudos for that. I thought that was great. But now we have here in my class, we have a book on military medals. Does the Salvation Army have a similar book where we can look at uniforms, to kind of date, old photographs or epaulets, or emblems or buttons or whatever the case may be? Is there a publication about that?
Wouldn't that be nice if there was? The thing is with the uniforms is it's funny. One of the few things that's uniform for us is uniforms. The uniforms differ from different parts of the world. For example, in the tropics they wear white uniforms. In Africa they wear a kind of a tan uniform. In India they wear saris. So it varies a great deal. The second thing is the uniform tends to evolve over time. There's very few like big dividing places on one style of uniform to another. So that's where your archivists in these different places can help you, because they would be able to look at a uniform and say, this looks like that, because they've seen enough of these and have watched the evolution. But and I would dare say that because I've done the research and so on, and I've been in our publications so much looking at things over the years, I would know, but I don't think most Salvation Army people would know. But there is not anything like that. We don't really have many medals. We're there's a high premium on humility in the Salvation Army, so we don't give medals to speak of. We have one or two, and then if you get it, most people don't wear it because it'd be kind of like bragging. So there it is. We don't really have that. Now, the S's that we have, those have been pretty much the same over the whole period of time. In fact, that's one of the ways you tell a Salvation Army uniform is by the S's. The epaulets, even the ranks on the epaulets have changed over a period of time. We used to have more ranks than we do now. We used to have something called adjutant. We used to have something called ensign. We had something called brigadier. Those ranks have been eliminated and are considered archaic, and really there may be one or two old brigadiers still around, but they're not brigadier generals or brigadiers. But pretty much the ranks are what I gave you earlier, and those most Salvationists could look at the epaulet and recognize what the rank is.
I know you've written several books on the history of the Salvation Army. Have you ever considered in your retirement writing a book about the uniforms and the epaulets and so on and so on?
No. I have considered writing. We are right now the last national history. We have the Salvation Army. I think you have it there, Marching to Glory. The last that was written through the early 1990s, so we're due for another one, and I'm actually thinking about trying to do that for release sometime in early 2021 or 22 or something like that. So because a lot's happened in the last 30 years. Obviously, the Salvation Army, like everybody, has been affected by technology advances. We've had some major disasters, Hurricane Andrew, Katrina, and so on. The Salvation Army does a lot of disaster work. The culture in our country has changed dramatically. And so, again, we were the first ordained women, but we're certainly not exclusive of that anymore. A lot of denominations ordain women now, so it's not such a remarkable thing. So, again, those changes in culture have impact with the Salvation Army, and Some we've resisted, some we've embraced.
Now, your magazine, War Cry, there are many projects going on across the country to preserve America's, culture. And like the Chronicling America project through the Library of Congress, the LDS, church is digitizing a lot of books to preserve, the history of people here in the country. Have you ever thought of approaching either Chronicling America at the Library of Congress, or perhaps writing a digital grant, or approaching the LDS to get those War Cry magazines digitized?
Well, it's unlikely LDS would help us because they're kind of another church group, so they would healthy competition, I suppose. But as far as those other things, I'm not sure what they're trying to do. I know that there is some effort being made in especially the Southern Territory to digitize our things. But one thing is, for example, our war cries are not indexed. Again, they used to be a weekly, and the 4 territories at one time all had their own war cry. So you had 4 editions covering their geographic area. And it's just a ton of information. Indexing is slow even if it's digitized. Now, of course, a lot of these things are searchable now. But again, we're moving toward that. The problem is, again, the Salvation Army, with its work, of course, people expect us to spend our money on helping people and doing things like trying to enhance our historical collection. Most donors would not consider that to be what they want to support. So we have to do it carefully. Occasionally we have some money given to us for that purpose, and we can do it. But I know efforts are being made. Like this database that I just told you about has only been up for about the last year. So it's very new, and we're very pleased to have that. And that certainly it makes things much better than it's been. But we're kind of doing like the more major records first, and then burrowing down hopefully to the war. I think someday it'll happen, but it's not right now.
Now, you mentioned the different territories. Obviously, my grandmother was in, I believe you said it was the Central Territory.
Right.
But when I was reading about Salvation Army preparing for today's presentation, I noticed that the Salvation Army was really strong in New York, and yet my grandma lived in the North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota area. Can you kind of, touch a little bit more, for everyone's benefit, for their ancestors that lived in different parts of the country, what areas were, perhaps the strongest?
Well, actually, I'm from the South, and the South was the slowest to develop because, of course, the South was very sparsely populated for a very long time. I'm from Florida originally, as you said earlier, and Florida for many years was almost deserted because of malaria and yellow fever and no air conditioning. That's another thing that kept people out. And of course you still have states now with a relatively small population, Wyoming and so on. So the Salvation Army, it was strong in the industrial areas of the North originally because we did our best work among the working class. And so again, New York, Chicago, what was now called the Rust Belt. We were very strong there. Less so now because, again, those places have fallen on hard times. A lot of the places are smaller or whatever, or can't economically afford to have a Salvation Army. The other places that we were very strong, for example, in Oklahoma during the first oil boom. But now Oklahoma, that's largely passed, and some of the towns that were boom towns are no longer in existence. They're totally gone. So we had places there, but they're gone. You had West Virginia is a good example. West Virginia during the coal mining boom, which lasted many years, a lot of Salvation Army operations there, but now they're all closing because the towns are disappearing there. So we where the Scandinavians were, the Salvation Army is very strong. Minnesota would be a good example, and Wisconsin, places like that. California was a stronghold for us, still is. We've done well there, and again, we do well. We do better in the urban areas, but in the early days of the Salvation Army, we were in most any town of any size. By any size, I mean, a good-sized town back in the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th century and 20th century, was 5,000 people. But now, of course, that you'd hardly notice a town of that size. So again, it's very hard to say because we had these ups and downs. We also had early in our history a couple of splits that were very harmful to us. One was in 1884 and nearly killed the Salvation Army of the United States. And then in 1896 there was another one. It wasn't really a true split, but nonetheless it was very damaging, where one of our leaders left and a lot of people left with him. And that kind of set us back in different places. We recovered, but it took some time. But we always say, how far would we have been had those things not happened? But no one can know. Anyway, so, it's hard to say. Again, I wish I could give you a clear answer and say, oh, you can go definitely to this place and you're going to find a lot of good Salvation Army stuff, because it is very, it's varied. I mean, it's just varied according to what that local history was. Let me give you an example. In the South, we have a town called Greenville, South Carolina, which is a nice town, decent size, but really is not remarkable amongst southern towns. But the Salvation Army has always had a strong presence there and always done very well there. And you go to the next town over, the Salvation Army hasn't done so well. So, again, it's not like you can, it's not science, is I guess what I'm saying.
Now, you mentioned Hurricane Katrina, but I don't know if the class knows, because I was reading about the Salvation Army this morning, that they made donations of over $365 million to serve more than 1.7 million people in the states that were affected by Hurricane Katrina. So I thought that was definitely worth mentioning.
Yeah, our disaster work has been quite large. We don't get quite the media attention others do, but we normally go in with canteens and we serve meals at the spots where people are most affected. And then more recently, since Hurricane Andrew, that was kind of a turning point for us. With Hurricane Andrew that hit Florida, I think it was 1992, we started to do more long-term care, which is helping people rebuild their homes and that kind of thing. That was, we work with groups like Habitat for Humanity. We have a good cooperative agreement with them. So we've started to do more long-term rehabilitation. And Katrina was a good example of that. We stayed in New Orleans for a very, very long time, working with the local population, but also in Mississippi and other parts of Louisiana. So again, it depends. We had these big floods in Houston a year or two ago, and same thing. The Salvation Army stayed behind to help people rehabilitate their homes, and if they could be rehabilitated, and also help them build new homes, get them furnished, and that sort of thing. So it's more than just clothing and a hot meal. It's more comprehensive and more holistic than it's been in the past.
Which is exactly why my grandma became a member of the Salvation Army, because her family had suffered a house fire and they lost everything. They lost their clothes, they lost their furniture, they lost their family photos, they lost everything. And they went to their church in the little town in North Dakota which they lived, and the church wouldn't help them. And the Salvation Army stepped up, and that's exactly why my grandma Edith went over and became, a officer in the Salvation Army.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that.
She was forever thankful for that. I can tell you because I knew my grandma.
Yeah.
Anyhow, I also wanted to let the class know that the Salvation Army was actually one of the first relief agencies on the scene of 9/11. That's one thing that I think that maybe a lot of my people here in the class today don't know.
Yeah, we did a lot of service for the front people, like the firemen and the police, of course. And then, of course, for the long term, when people were going through the rubble and all that very terrible, terrible times. So, and our folks, their service was, again, some of it was not, in one way, it wasn't that remarkable. Another way it was, part of what we did was some of our folks washed the feet of the firemen as they came out of the rubble, and it was just a very lovely act of love and very much appreciated. And many of the guys were just moved to tears by it. So, it doesn't grab headlines, but it's what's needed at the time.
Yes, we have another question.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
The question was, where does the funding come from to do all this?
Well, it comes from the public. We get some government funding on specific programs, but when we talk about disaster aid, when we talk about Christmas assistance that we give, all the gifts to the children and so on, that's all provided by the public. There's no government funds involved in that whatsoever. Probably, if you looked at a breakdown of our overall budget across the whole United States, about 90% of our money comes from donations from the public. That would include United Way, and then the rest, the 10%, might be from government programs. But some programs, like we have something called the Adult Rehabilitation Center, which is where people go who are addicted to drugs and alcohol, and those are funded by the thrift stores, where people buy the things and so on. So the surplus income from the thrift stores funds that program. So those men and women who come into the programs for that rehabilitation, they don't have to pay anything for it, and we don't get any government money for it. It's all entirely supported by the red truck going around picking up goods and that sort of thing.
I also read in an article that the items of clothing that does not get sold gets recycled, so nothing goes in the landfill.
Yeah, we're good at recycling. We're one of the first recyclers. Actually, the whole idea of picking up things from people's homes and trying to fix them or whatever, that originated with the Salvation Army. Nobody was doing it before we did, and so we're one of the original recyclers. Now, of course, it's far more in vogue, but we do that. So sometimes we get clothing that cannot be worn. I mean, it's ripped or whatever, and so we bale that, and that's then recycled in various ways. So yeah, you're right. We don't throw it in the landfill.
Very admirable. Now, recently I was at a Sons of Norway meeting, and here locally in Reno, and I was talking to the members over there that, as not being able to speak Norwegian, I'm at a real disadvantage trying to find my Norwegian ancestors. And they said, well, why don't you contact the Salvation Army in Norway? They have a people tracing or family tracing service. And I went, you're kidding me. I didn't know that. Could you talk a little bit about the family tracing service?
Well, before internet became sort of the way most people track people down, we did what we call missing person service. And we had a success rate about 50%, which compared to detective agencies, their success rate at that time was 10%. So because we're international and we have so many locations, people would say, I'm looking for my Aunt Nellie. We lost track of her 30 years ago or whatever. We think she's here. And so the Salvation Army would through various ways, make inquiries or do some investigation. In fact, I've been involved with 2 or 3 of those where there was, and you mentioned Norway, there was a family, one of the brothers had immigrated from Norway to the United States after the Second World War, and they just lost track of each other. And it had been 30, 35 years, and heard nothing from him. And so I went to his home and knocked on the door and said, your relatives are looking for you. And he was totally amazed. He thought they'd all forgotten about him, and just again started crying and everything because it just was overwhelming to him at that moment. So we it was kind of neat to be a part of that. And so we gave him the contact information, and presumably he followed through. But we've done that. In some places we still do it, as mentioned by your friends. But again, the internet is a lot more convenient for most people, and they do it that way. So we don't do it everywhere anymore like we did. But occasionally we are asked, even now, to try to find somebody. We can't disclose, for confidentiality reasons, we cannot disclose who's staying in our shelters. And we won't even do that with law enforcement. They call and say, Joe Smith at your place? And we just have to say we can't disclose that. And they don't like it sometimes, but, we just have to protect people's confidentiality. So we can't disclose that. Another thing that you need to be aware of, too, is we had in the United States for a long time a number of homes for unwed mothers, and that's where young teens or whatever, single women who were not married and were pregnant when a day is considered to be a taboo, they would come to these home and hospitals, and they would stay there till it was time to deliver their babies. Then they decided whether they wanted to keep the baby or put the baby up for adoption. Well, a lot of people in those days put babies up for adoption. So occasionally we have inquiries from people who understood that they were born, or their mother or their grandmother or grandfather, whatever, was born in a Salvation Army home and hospital. Those records are all here. And there's some, even now there's some confidentiality issues with that, but there is a way people can access that information. And for a lot of people, that's a real a boon, because they don't know the lineage of their birth family.
Wow, that's wonderful, especially for people who are seeking their family tree. Wonderful. Because we actually do have in my class 2 adopted people, and we've actually had several guest speakers who talk about adoption genealogy research. So thank you. I didn't know that. That was news to me. Now, when I was reading about the Salvation Army this morning, I read an article that talked about how back in the late 1800s, judges would sentence people to go to the Salvation Army to get straightened up as part of their punishment for being, whether it was alcohol or drugs or whatever the case may be. How common was that? Do you know? I mean,
it still happens.
Oh, it still does.
Yeah. Well, sometimes usually they give the guys a choice. It's mostly men. Sorry, men, but mostly men. And what they'll say is, Fred, you can either go to prison or go to the Salvation Army Rehabilitation Center. And depending on who Fred is, most of them will opt for going to the Salvation Army, but they can't force them to, but they can say, this is your choice. So that still happens, and happens fairly frequently.
That's interesting because, it's funny. I have found jail records for some of my ancestors, but it never occurred to me that they may have been sentenced as part of their payback to society to going and working with the Salvation Army. So that's interesting. I'm going to start looking for that a little bit further and deeper.
Yeah.
Let's see here. I've got more questions. Do you have questions?
Just a comment. Since you come from prisoners, okay, could your grandmother, captain of the Salvation Army, sentenced to?
No, I don't think so. I've got a lot of records about her. A lot of records.
Okay. But my question is all the passenger jetliners above your shoulders, your head there on the shelf, I was wondering about that.
Oh, yeah, I got them all around my office. As was said, I served overseas, and and with my books, I've traveled pretty extensively. So these represent the airlines I've flown on. I've got about 43 different airlines. Of course, some of them no longer exist. So they're relics, like I'm getting to be.
Okay, I was just wondering. So it's kind of a collection.
It is a collection. It serves no purpose except it's sort of like a different type of travel log.
It keeps you grounded. And that's a pun.
Could you tell us a little bit about your heritage centers?
Yeah, depending, again, they're in different levels of development. The international one is in London, and that one is the most extensive. Of course, that's where our international headquarters is, and so on. So if anybody has a British ancestor who was a Salvationist, that's where you go. And again, I would say to you too, if you know that your ancestors were Salvationists in these different countries, you can write to them. Some are really well done and well handled, like you mentioned, Norway and so on, well I guess, I don't say equipped. That's what I'm looking for. Well equipped. Others are not as much. France would not be as helpful to you as England, for example. But the 4 in the United States. Oh, and there's also one in Canada. I should have mentioned there's one in Toronto, and that one's a very good one for Canada. And let me just talk about Canada for just a minute, kind of on a side comment on this. During part of this Darkest England scheme that I talked about with William Booth included helping people emigrate to certain countries. At that time, a lot of people wanted to emigrate, especially the poor people. They saw different parts of the world as a place of opportunity. They were dead-end places. So South Africa, what is now Zimbabwe, Australia, and Canada were the favorite places to emigrate, especially Canada. So shiploads of people were sponsored by the Salvation Army, came to Canada. Salvation Army helped people settle. And so a lot of the immigrants or Canadian people have Salvation Army people or people who were brought over on Salvation Army ships. They weren't necessarily Salvationists, but they came over on our ships. And that's how they got there. And some of those emigrated down into the United States, especially, again, in Michigan and some of those border states, et cetera. So that's Canada. Canada would have a lot of information about that. The other ones, Chicago has a pretty good operating one. The Western Territory it's in Rancho Palos Verdes, which is in the LA area. Theirs right now is undergoing a major renovation, so you can't get any information out of them right now. The Eastern Territory has a very good one. The South has a very good one that's getting better all the time. And of course here at National Headquarters. So you have 5 different places to go. And they're not linked, so you need to know that. They're not linked. They're all kind of independent operations. So any one of those, but if the thing is they're just dying to help people because they love what they're doing. And they're like most people who work in libraries and archives, is they're glad when people ask for assistance because that's why they have all this knowledge.
Wonderful. I also wanted to let the class know, if they're not aware, that the Salvation Army was one of the original 6 organizations that made up the USO, which included the YMCA, the YWCA, the National Catholic Community Services, National Jewish Welfare Board, and the National Travelers Aid Association. So I'm DAR, and I know we work a lot with USO to help the USO out. So that was something I didn't realize about the Salvation Army until this morning.
Yeah, we no longer belong to USO, but we did for many, many years. Part of being a Salvationist is we not only do you have to agree to what we believe, but also we have certain practices. We don't use alcohol, we don't use tobacco, we don't gamble. Sorry, Reno. We just, the number of things we don't do. We do some good things, other things too, but we just don't do those things that we have found in our experience are vices that some people cannot escape. So when the USO began serving alcohol, the Salvation Army parted ways with them. And this is about 20, 25 years ago.
Okay, interesting. Okay, let's see here. I wrote down all these questions here. You already kind of touched on Canada. I wanted to talk about that because a lot of people in this class probably have relatives that were up in Canada, so I don't need to ask that question. And let's see here. I think that was all my questions.
Okay.
Did anyone else have any questions? No? Okay, well, let's give them a big... Oh, wait a minute. We do have another question.
Okay.
I have a question about can you give us an overview of, I've got an ancestor who seems to come to Kansas City to have a child. Is there a possibility that they went out of state and came back here?
Okay.
Doing research for that.
Okay. Yeah, because a lot of times when the young girls were pregnant, they didn't even stay in their state; they traveled somewhere else. And I don't know enough about that part of it to help you out. And again, these records of the home and hospitals are we're very careful of those, even though some of these people have long since gone to glory, who were born there. We're very, very careful with them because, of course, it was highly confidential when the girls came in, and what they chose to do with their children. So really, Susan Mitchum, whose address I gave to you earlier, she would be the one to make any inquiries with, because she's the one who absolutely has total control over those records. But again, if they didn't stay in the immediate area, it would be hard to know what happened to them. Now the thing is, when the girls went into these homes, they were kind of shut off from the rest of the world until they had their babies and decided to go home. Again, for their own protection, in this day and age, it was considered, a great scandal when a girl became pregnant. So they were kind of, I hate to say it's like sort of like a monastery type thing, but in some ways it was. The girls did go out for different things, but they had to be very careful, and everything was kind of within there. And in fact, many of them, I say home and hospital, some of them, the maternity homes were linked to a regular hospital, but many of them had their own delivery rooms there, so the girls did not even have to leave there when it was time to have their babies. So again, the whole confidentiality thing was maintained.
How did the girls? How were the children adopted out?
Well, we did not handle the adoptions. They would have gone through adoption agencies. Yeah, whoever.
So your facility was just the caring for the girl while she was pregnant, and then the actual delivery, but then the babies were given to adoption. I assume these are probably county adoption agencies.
Well, again, it varies. I mean, you got the Children's Home Society, which has been around forever, and Florence Crittenden Homes, which had been around forever, and some of them the babies would have gone there, or to whatever government group was handling adoptions at that time. I think it depended on where they were and who was doing it.
Wonderful information.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, well, let's give them a big hand, shall we?
Thank you.
Kind of give you a tour of the class here. Can you see it on the camera?
Okay.
I'm going to let you see Can you see the screens up at the front of the class?
Gee, you should make me look younger.
kind of giving you like a tour of the room. Everybody want to wave?
Yeah, thank you. I'm waving here. Yes, very good. Great.
Okay, well, we cannot thank you enough for your wonderful presentation, and I will send out the slides to every one of the students. And if it's okay with you, we're going to go ahead and send out the recording as well. Is that okay?
I have no problem with that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Oh, and I wanted to share with you before you leave, the books I have on the history of the Salvation Army. I have The Life and Ministry of William Booth. I have Origins of the Salvation Army by Norman Murdoch. I have Hallelujah Lads and Lassies by Lillian Tultz.
Oh, that's good.
I have Red Hot and Righteous, The Urban Religion of the Salvation Army by Diane Winston. And, of course, the one you and I spoke about the other day, Marching to Glory.
Marching to Glory, yeah. I'm not a fan of Murdoch's book, so I just have to say that to you. Don't read Murdoch's book, which means you go...
Well, if you can recommend any others for purchase, you can go ahead and email me. I'd be more than happy.
Again, if you go to this crestbooks.com, whatever, there's going to be a number of books that are in print right now that you can get, and some of them are as cheap as 99 cents. So they're relatively inexpensive.
Wonderful to know. Yeah, I was really, like I said, this is something that I've been interested in for many years. I learned a great deal today. So once again, thank you very, very much for your time.
Well, thank you. It's good to be with you.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.